Hi, this is Sven from Webiny, and I'm going to help you guide you through the evaluation of Webiny Headless CMS. We're going to start with a basic overview of the product, as well as create our first content model, just so you see how that experience looks like. Once we have the content model created, we're going to go over how do you use the API, because creation of content model expands that API. After which, we're going to create some content entries and look at how the revision system works inside the Headless CMS. Once we have some content entries, we can then go over different ways of organizing that content inside the platform, as well as how do you search and filter through that content. Lastly, we'll get to the most interesting part of the guide, which is we're going to enrich the Headless CMS experience with some customizations. 3 in particular. We're going to activate the live preview. We're going to introduce a new content model, but through a code plugin. And lastly, we'll integrate with OpenAI. Hopefully all this makes sense. So let's get started with the basic overview. In front of me, I have the Webiny instance that we created in the previous chapter. I'm now logged into the admin dashboard. In case you need a reminder, if you can't find the URL to your Webiny instance, so in your terminal, I'm here inside the root directory of the project I've created. If I just run yarn Webiny info, and we just want the development branch, if I run that command, this is going to scan through my state files for that environment and extract some core information. Part of that information is the URL to the admin dashboard. So if I would just click that URL under the admin app, it's going to lead me to my dashboard. If we now navigate to the main menu, we can expand the Headless CMS group, and under there we can go to the models. This is going to display a list of all the content models we have in the system. A content model is a definition of a data schema, and inside the content model, once you define the data schema, you can add entries. So let's start with defining a very basic content model. Let's click the new model button. Let's call this content model products. So we need to give it a singular name and a plural name. Now, in certain cases, you might want to have a content model that only has a single entry. A typical use case for that is if you have a configuration for your website, you only want to have one configuration with all the properties you need. You don't want to have multiple entries of configurations. So for such a use case, you would click this single entry model, and then you would just have the singular API name for that content model, as well as you would be only able to create a single entry in the system for that configuration. The content model group, essentially in the main menu, we can create certain groups, and for example, let's say we have a group for product, which has product entries as well as product categories and product tags and things like that. So we'd have a group called products, and then let's say we have another group that holds our front-end user accounts. So we would create a new group for the users, and under that we would have the user entries and all of the related user attributes and similar. For now, we'll just use the default ungrouped option, and let's give it an icon. Let's do a box which represents the products. Let's just give it a basic description, and we're going to leave this box ticked, create models with default fields. Essentially, this is going to create a content model that's going to already have a title, a description, and an image field attached to it. So let's click create model. And the model is basically now created, and the system automatically redirected us to this content model editor view. Whenever we define a content model through the user interface or through the API, we can access this editor where we can then rearrange the fields, remove fields, add new fields, and change some appearance around the fields, as well as its validation rules and similar. Now there's a third way how we can define content models besides through the UI and API. We can define content models through code. We're going to do that exercise towards the end of this guide. All right, so if we click now the preview button here, this is going to show us how the form looks for the like to the content editor, so a person that's going to be managing the content in your system. The cool thing with Webiny is that not only you define the schema on this window, but you also define the appearance. So I've now just moved the image below the description, and you see my form looks different. The appearance, the visual appearance on the form is very important when it comes to the editorial experience, especially if you're dealing with very large and complex content models. If you click Edit under any of the fields, dialog is going to appear where we can manage different properties around that field. Every field has a label and an ID. The ID is the name of the field when we retrieve its data through the API. The label is used for visual representation purposes, so basically it's the label of the form. And then you have some additional options on the page here as well. Besides the general tab, depending on the field type, this is a text field type, we will have in case of text, we have the predefined values. For example, I'll show you when we add another field how the predefined values works. But essentially, you also have access to the validators. Again, validators are you will have a different list depending on the field type you're looking at, as well as appearance. So in this case, we got only text and hidden. We're going to basically go through a few other options, but every field has its, let's say, appearance, which is how it's visually represented to the content editor on the screen. The cool thing with the appearance is these are all plugins. So if you want to have a different appearance, let's say I want to have not an input, but something that pulls the data from a third-party CRM system, I can edit its appearance, take over the render or function of that component, add my own custom render. There opens some other dialog that searches, let's say, user accounts or products from a third-party API, and then copies that data back into Webiny. For that, I'm okay with text as the storage layer, so how the data is going to be stored in index in Webiny, but I just want to change its appearance. Besides changing the appearance, you can also change the storage layer, which is a much more advanced use case, but you can essentially take control over how the data is stored on the database layer, how it's indexed, how it's searched, sorted, and so on, giving you a plethora of capabilities with regards to that. All right, I don't want to change anything here. I'm just going to press Save Field, but let's add another field to this content model. Let's add the rich text field. Let's call this long product description. And I'm going to save that field. And let's add another field called product category. For that, I'm going to use text. I'm going to put it inline here. Just name it category. And here I want to use the predefined values. This means that this input is no longer going to be rendered as a free form input. Instead, we're going to have a list of predefined values. So let's call this, let's give it a few options. Let's just use those two. And now under appearance, we have a couple of more options. We have radio, select, or hidden field. If I were to change this as a list of text, instead of radio, I would have checkboxes. So by changing this to a list of text, I instruct to the system that, hey, users can actually select one or more predefined values, not just one. But in our case, we just want one, and we want to use a select box for this field. All right. So if you go now under the preview, you can see our form is looking quite different. We've got the rich text bits where we can attach links, change the appearance and so on, right? As well as the categories. When it comes to the fields here, so Webiny comes with a list of pre-built fields. You can see them here on the screen. You got the simple ones as well as more complex like references, objects. Again, if you insert, for example, an object and then set it as a list of objects, you can essentially have a repeatable object with multiple entries. Dynamic zone, it's a much more complex a field that expands dynamically your schema. We're going to talk about that down the line. You can also attach images, files, multiple images, and so on, right? If you click the cog here, we can go back to that initial form that helped us create the initial content model. For now, this is just for your references. We don't want to change here anything, but we do want to change now this, we do want to save this content model. So when we press save, essentially, one interesting thing about Webiny, when we did press the save button, Webiny validated if your GraphQL schema is fully valid still, because in a very, very rare case where you have, let's say, custom extensions, and extensions, let's say, can cause an issue with the schema, Webiny can pick that up in that validation process, and it would tell you, hey, you can't save this, there's an error in your schema, we don't want to save it because it can affect your production API and so on. So it kind of has some safety mechanisms under the hood. At this point, make sure you have the same content model created inside your own Webiny instance, as in the next chapter we'll explore the API, after which we'll then create some entries in the system. If you now go back, if you now click the main menu, and towards the bottom we click on the API playground, here we're presented with 4 different API endpoints. Every endpoint has its own URL, so if we switch between the tabs, you'll see that this is the manage endpoint, this is the read, this is the preview, and we have the main endpoint. The main endpoint is the core API of Webiny. Through the main endpoint, you manage users, you manage tenants, you manage assets. Basically, you manage everything with the exception of the Headless CMS. When it comes to the Headless CMS side of things, we have the manage, read, and preview APIs. The manage API is the API that's used to, basically manage your content models, entries. The manage API has the capability to create new content models, modify them, delete them, as well as entries. So basically it comes equipped with both the queries and necessary mutations. The read API, on the other hand, only has the queries that allow you to read the entries from the content models, and it can only read the published entries. Unlike the preview API, which reads always the latest version of the content entry, regardless if that latest version is published or unpublished. In practice, the preview API allows you to preview how a content will look like when it's published, while the read API is the one you're going to use in production because it only has access to the published content, which basically you are ready to share with your audience. The other notable difference is that the Manage API, in the way when you read the data through the Manage API, is going to have a different structure than when you read the data from the Read API. The Read is more optimized for reading, and it already extracts the values of reference attributes and so on, which the Manage API doesn't. We can click the Docs tab on the sidebar to explore all of the queries and mutations we have available, and as we switch between the tabs, those will of course change. So for example, let's get a list of all of the content models that we have. So if we just go here, we can delete this and list content models. Now, one thing with regards to the API is that there's always a structure to it. there's like an envelope tied to how you access the data. So all of your attributes are under the data attribute. Meta information contains things like how many records are there more records for pagination purposes, and the error attribute contains the error message in case there is one. So if you go on the data, here we can see all of the properties we have access to. So let's do name, and let's do model ID. So if you run this query, you'll see that here is the product's content model that we've just created. Now, when it comes to accessing the API from your application, basically anywhere outside Webiny, there are a few things that you need to consider. So I'll just switch tabs here. On our docs portal, under the Headless CMS section, there's a page called Using the GraphQL API. So we just demonstrated the API playground, and when it comes to that programmatic access, right? So first of all, you'll need to have a client because Webiny uses a GraphQL API standard. You can use any GraphQL client. Here are a few recommendations from our side, but essentially you can use any you want. And to your client, you'll provide one of the URLs again that we've shown here as an endpoint, right? But all of these endpoints are protected. So anybody from the outside, if they try to ping the endpoint, they'll get an error purely because those endpoints are behind a security layer. And in order to pass through the security, they need to be authorized. The authorization is done through an API key. So essentially, as part of your request on the GraphQL client, you would send the authorization header with a bearer string, and then you would attach the API key towards the end. This is going to get you to the API. Now, there's another caveat to that, which is when you have Webiny in a multi-tenanted setup. Essentially, all of the Webiny enterprise instances are multi-tenanted by default. And as such, the system needs to know which tenant you want to access, because every tenant can have their own content models, their own different data structures, and so on. So in a multi-tenanted setup, you would need to also provide an X-tenant header. So here we've got an example of how to use multi-tenancy in Webiny. You would basically need to provide a header with an X-tenant value. If you are accessing the root tenant, the value of the X-tenant header would be root. But if you are accessing any other tenant, then the value of the X-tenant header would be the ID of that particular tenant. Coming back to the API key, now to create an API key, basically you would go under the security, API keys, you would give certain permissions to that API key, because you can also say, hey, is this API key only for the read API, or can you actually manage certain things as well? And then you can define the scope. Is it for all content models? Is it for all locales, and so on? So there's a couple of different options you can have there, giving you basically a very, very fine-grained control of specifying what you can do with that API key. And once it's created, you will get it printed on the screen. You can copy it, and again, you would just add it to that authorization header, and that will give you access to that particular endpoint. All right, let's now get back to our instance. And if you open the main menu now and expand the Headless CMS section, we'll see the newly created content model is visible there under the ungrouped group. So if you click on it, it's going to load this data list. Essentially, this is the screen that shows all of the records we have under the product's content model. Typically, content editors will use this screen to filter content, look for content, and as they create the content, the newly created content is going to be visible on this screen. Because this is a brand new content model, it's empty. So we have nothing here on the list. So let's start populating the list by creating a new product. So if you click the new product bit here, and we can now populate our form. You can see that this form looks identical to the one that we've created in the content editor, and that was essentially the goal. So let's give it a title. We'll set some category for it, give it a description, and some random text. For the image, let's just find a random image on Google. So let's do product demo, whatever we call it. All right, let's take this image. Just going to use it for the demo purposes. Save image. Now let's get back to our instance. If we click the image, this is going to load up our digital asset management tool. Let's create a folder for our product images. Let's access the folder. And now we can just drag and drop the image that we downloaded. Wait for the image to appear. And now we can select it and it's going to be part of our product. Now that we've populated our entry, we can save it. All right, entry saved successfully. At this point, let's talk a bit about the revision system powering Webiny. So if we navigate to the revisions tab here, we'll see that we have a draft entry. It's version 1. It was last modified by myself on this date, right? Essentially, what Webiny allows you to do is to, first of all, have multiple drafts of a particular entry. So if we go here and we can click New revision from current, we're now inside version 2 of our draft. Let's call it version 2. Let's save it. But also version 1 is in draft. So if you go back to version 1, you see that the content updates based on how we made the change. So that's one of the benefits of the Webiny revision system, is that you can prepare multiple draft versions of your content. Let's say a typical use case would be, I've got a product page, let's say version 1 that's live. I prepare version 2 of that product page that's going to go live for the Black Friday sale. And then I can prepare another draft version that's going to go live for the Cyber Monday sale. And then a third draft that's going to go live after the Cyber Monday ends, right? So this allows me to kind of have that, all of that content prepared well in advance, right? The other benefit of the Webiny revision system is, so let's go to version 1. Let's now save and publish. So this is going to say, hey, I'm about to publish. I just need to confirm my action. So now this was successfully published. By publishing this entry, I'm giving the read API access to it. So if I were to go to the API playground now and list all of the products on the read API, this entry would be shown there because it is published. Previously, while it was just in a draft state, it wouldn't be visible, right? But let's say then I also go to version 2 and I publish version 2. What now happens is, if you navigate to the revision tab, is version 1 is locked. That means I can't edit version 1 anymore. The general rule is that if a piece of content, if a revision was published at any point in time, that revision can't be changed anymore, right? We are essentially leaving that as a snapshot in time in case we need to revert back. Say let's say we created version 2 and well, it had an error or a typo, whatnot, and we urgently need to revert back to version 1. So if we go here to version 1, we can republish instantly version 1, and that automatically updates what's accessible to the read API. And essentially it would return version 1 again, right? Now, how do I modify version 2? Because that's where the error was. Well, I just go and create a version 3 out of that version 2 and say I fix my typo, whatever. I can again keep it in a draft state, or I can publish again another version, and this way the previous are locked and version 3 is the one that's live. Essentially, the revision system always keeps a track of the changes. If at any point a revision was live, it's left as a locked snapshot, so you can always revert back to it. You can always have multiple draft versions of it, and you can always kind of, let's say I want to create version 4 out of version 1, right? Not out of version 3. I would just go to version 1 and say, hey, new one. It's going to create version 4, but out of version 1, right? Now, let's have a look at the state. So version 3 with this title is the one that's published, and version 4 with this title is the latest draft. If you go to the playground and under the read API, we'll find list products, and let's list the products. You'll see that the read API returns the published version of the content, and if we do the same query in the preview, it actually returns the latest draft, right? So that's kind of like where you would use the preview versus the read, because for example, let's say you have a custom front end where your content editors can preview a draft version of a content. There you would use the preview API instead of the read API. Read API would be used on your public website front end. If we go back to the overview of this course, so we did the basic overview of Headless CMS. We created our first content model. We've gone through the API, the differences between them and how to use them with some examples. And we created a content entry and talked about how the revision system works. So far we're here. And in the next chapter, we'll do the content organization as well as searching and filtering content before proceeding to the last chapter where we're going to be customizing the overall Headless CMS experience.